Welcome to Wild Questions. I'm Sabbath Kapahu, and this is the moment we take each week to have the conversations we know are important, but don't always talk about. This is about the stories that matter behind the questions we ask. I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and CEO of Wild Leaders, Dr. Rob Mckenna. Dr. Mckenna, where are you right now?
I'm somewhere in the Americas.
Perfect. That is a great description. We need you to be somewhere, and somewhere is great. Today, the question that I want to ask that we are wondering about is what are the faces of pressure? What are the faces of pressure? You talk about this in your book, Composed. We just finished a wild conversation, incredible conversation this morning. And this idea of pressure came up in the chat in a bunch of different ways. And so today we're asking in our wild questions, what are the faces of pressure? Can you describe this to me?
Yeah, and it came up, Sabbath, because we were talking about this feeling of being overwhelmed and underproductive, and folks having a conversation around what is that feeling that they have. And we had talked through these previous weeks on how do we build structures around our lives that work. What is that feeling about where we feel we are overwhelmed, like we have too much to do? Today the topic on jobs that are too big. And the fundamental thing that these different pieces of the puzzle that we have talked about share is this idea of pressure. And so what that job that's too big, or even when we feel like we're just overwhelmed with life and work, is I think one of the most important starting points is to understand or to name what those faces of pressure are in your life and work. What do they look like? And here's the thing about it. So I wrote something I'm going to read from the beginning part of the book. And what I wrote was this. It says, think about a high pressure situation you faced in the last week. Was it a moment where you felt pressure inside of yourself, but no one else around you felt anything? Did it involve a direct or potential conflict with someone else? Or was the pressure caused by something that changed in your environment? You may feel that your situation had all three going on at the same time. In what ways was that situation triggered by something inside of you? In what ways was it triggered by your relationship to someone else? Or was it triggered by something around you that may have been felt like it was outside of your control? And when I started the book and wrote this, I had to address, like, what is pressure? And I described pressure as this invisible force that tells you that something is changing. And change is a part of the developmental process. And so it's necessary for us to understand that change is this reality. It's not only a reality when people say like change is the most common thing, but it's also that change also implies a connection into development, like something about us is changing. And so the reason why we talked about this morning was that understanding and naming the pressure that you're facing is the start. Otherwise, we face all these moments of feeling overwhelmed, just like, oh, I feel overwhelmed. We're just overwhelmed by the feelings without any kind of structural reality that calls us back into some sense of control over what's actually happening. And so these faces of pressure, like in some cases, it's something that, like I described before, it's something that we experience inside of ourselves. So maybe no one else is even aware of it, but that's why I describe this as intrapersonal pressure. And that interpersonal pressure can affect how we think, how we feel, and what it is we do. But understanding, is that what you're feeling in this moment? The second one was interpersonal pressure. And this is probably the most common, is that people experience is this necessity for, it's relational. And there's a necessity for probably a conversation that is challenging to have, or that's important to have, but that you may not know how to have. And so naming it's either intrapersonal, so it's occurring inside of us. The other kind of pressure is interpersonal, between us and someone else. And then the last one is an environmental pressure. And we talk about this oftentimes at WiLD, that there's this interaction between what's going on inside of me, what's going on between me and my relationships to others and my work or my life, but then also that's affected by the structural realities of our lives, like whether or not I have a job description. You know what I mean? And there are certain things in our environment, even the culture or the norms and expectations that we feel can affect how we feel about our jobs, about ourselves, and so on. And so I think the first step in that is just to name it, is what you're feeling in this moment. And because we have to become better at pressure, because pressure, if it's a reality, it's related to development, it's occurring all the time. And it's actually our friend or could be our friend, even though it feels like this enemy. And so naming it is kind of the start. Is it within you? Is it between you and someone else? Or is it something that's occurring in your environment? Because without naming it, where do we go next? You know what I mean? So that's kind of the beginning, is in that.
Yeah, I there's so many things running through my head. One is in the chat this morning, I saw numerous people just becoming aware of, I am putting pressure on myself. I didn't even realize I was doing it. And so that naming, okay, this is a pressure. It's coming from within myself. What am I going to do with it next?
Yeah.
And then, of course, I read this and I brought it up. It's in your book. It says, we are only victims of the high pressure moments if we choose to be. And I feel like you said, naming that is how we can step into not being a victim of that moment of pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. And my hope is that people will feel an invitation to agency that they didn't know that they had. Agency being some sense of control over situations that have felt like they're out of control. And so I think that first step, even the naming it process, like you said this morning, we experienced that where people are like, I didn't even think about this reality that I could name this.
Mm-hmm.
And that by naming it, I might actually have some sense of a choice to make in the
Yeah.
process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So once we've named it and we realize there are phases of pressure, interpersonal, interpersonal, and the situational, what do we do now?
Yeah, so that's the start, is to be able to name it. And then the next steps, and this is what I break down in the book, is the second thing is understanding. Now you know where the pressure is coming from. What is your default in that moment? And I talk about truth speakers and peacekeepers. Is your default to sort of attack it and take control of it and to say it's all and really focus on what's important to you? Or is your default to try to make sure everyone else is pleased and happy and feeling good in this moment? Like, what is that default? And we call that a pressure profile. This is also in the leading under pressure inventory, which is one of the tools in the WiLD toolkit. But understanding which way I default, and if I default differently in different situations in my life. So understanding that specific context of whether you become more of a truth speaker or a peacekeeper in those moments is important. And then the last part is we wanted to know, just not just say like, okay, this is my default, but then the question is obviously, what do I do about it? And so
Mm-hmm.
in the rest of the book, and every chance I get to speak about this, I break down these 11 psychological strategies. These are actual things that I can do, and also ways that I can change my thinking to begin to take steps forward in showing up better in these high pressure moments. And so that's the step, is like naming the pressure, like which kind is it? One of those three. What's your default in those moments or in the situation that you're in? And then finally is, what can I do about it? And which of those strategies am I good at? And which of the things maybe with a little more work could help me in those moments, whether, no matter what kind of pressure you're facing. So that's that fundamental structure.
And I hear that there is change that's going to happen, a transformation that's going to take place when you go from naming and then understanding the tools and then actually taking action. And how amazing that in that moment of change that you have created for yourself, because you've become more aware that you're not a victim of that pressure anymore, and you're becoming who you actually want to become in those moments of pressure.
Yeah, that's right. That's awesome. It's good stuff.
That's so good. We're going to end our WiLD questions with a question from our WiLD deck of cards. And you mentioned the Leading Under Pressure inventory and our WiLD toolkit. We'll put links to more information about that in the video when we post this later on in our socials. So if you're interested about the actual tools, and we'll also put a link to Composed in there as well, where you break down all those 11 steps. Okay, for all of those who are listening and watching now, and those of you who are watching later, here's your WiLD question as we move through this season. What important details on your agenda are a part of your bigger purpose?
That's a good one.
These questions are amazing. We will see you all next time.
Thanks, Sabbath.